So, here's a question you've probably heard a million times. Are boys smarter than girls? It's a stereotype that's been around forever, right? But what does the science actually say? Well, today we're going to dig into it. We're talking brains, test scores, and some of the hidden biases that might be shaping the answers.
Okay, let's just get right to it. The big question. Are boys smarter than girls? To even begin to tackle this, we have to start with the one thing that's running the whole show. The brain.
For a long time, the whole argument was really just about biology. It was all about the physical stuff, what you can actually see and measure inside our skulls.
And at first, early studies seemed to give a pretty straightforward answer. They found that, on average, male brains are about 8 to 13% larger by volume than female brains. And for a while, people kind of went, well, there you have it, case closed. But, yeah, it's really not that simple.
This is where that whole bigger is better idea just completely falls apart. See, while male brains might be bigger on average, female brains have more folding. It's called gyrification. All those extra folds mean they actually have a greater surface area for the cortex. I mean, think about it. If brain size was all that mattered, sperm whales and elephants would be running the planet. So here's the real kicker. When scientists actually looked at about 1,400 brains using MRIs, they found something fascinating. Turns out, pretty much every brain is a unique mosaic of what we might call male-typical and female-typical features. The overlap is just so huge that trying to label the brain as strictly one or the other is, well, it's pretty much impossible.
All right, so looking at brain structure is kind of a dead end. What about how we actually perform? Let's take a look at test scores and see what the numbers really have to say.
Now, at first glance, some of the data seems to back up the old stereotype. If you look at the SATs in the US, for example, men historically scored about 33 points higher on the math and science sections.
But, and this is a big but, that SAT score is just one test on one day. When you look at actual school grades, the day-in, day-out work, the whole picture flips. In a whopping 70% of countries, women consistently get better grades than men. And that's across the board in language, math, and science.
So what are we supposed to make of all this? Well, big, major IQ studies find basically no difference in general intelligence between the sexes. We do see some slight average differences. Women tend to have an edge in verbal abilities, men in visual spatial skills, but the real takeaway comes from international tests. In lots of countries, performance is equal. That tells us this is probably less about biology and way more about culture and environment.
And that leads us to the real turning point here. What if the differences we see aren't actually about ability at all, but about the incredible power of what we believe? Let's talk about the hidden threat of stereotypes.
So there's this incredible psychological idea called stereotype threat. In one famous study, women were given a math test. When one group was told, hey, this test has shown gender differences in the past, they performed way worse than the men. But another group was told, this test shows no gender difference. And guess what? They scored the same as the men. The stereotype itself was actually changing the results.
And you can see this bias playing out in the real world in some pretty subtle ways. Just check out this Google search data. Parents are 2.5 times more likely to Google, "Is my son gifted?" than they are to search, "Is my daughter gifted?" And the wild part is, in the US, there are actually 11% more girls in gifted programs.
And sadly, kids pick up on these messages so early. One study found that at age 5, both boys and girls associated being really smart with their own gender. But just 1 year later, at age 6, the girls were already more likely to say that brilliance was a male trait. They were already starting to count themselves out of the game.
This kind of bias has huge, real-world consequences. Take a look at this powerful study. Science professors were given identical resumes for a lab manager job. The only thing that changed was the name at the top. Some were male, some were female. The results were stark. The professors consistently rated the male applicant as more competent, more hireable, and they offered him a starting salary that was, on average, $4,000 higher.
Now, that data is pretty tough to look at, I know, but the story absolutely does not end there. The research also shows us that there's a path forward, one that leads to more equality and recognizing brilliance wherever we find it.
Because despite all these barriers, brilliant women have always been there, making huge contributions. We're talking about people like Rosalind Franklin, whose work was essential to understanding DNA, or Katherine Johnson, who did the math that helped land Apollo 11 on the moon, or Maryam Mirzakhani, who became the first woman ever to win the Fields Medal, which is basically the Nobel Prize for mathematics.
So what does it all mean? I think this quote from fellow mathematician Isabella Laba just says it perfectly.
When Mirzakhani won her award, Laba said it didn't prove women were capable, she already knew that. What it proved was that we as a society are becoming better at encouraging and nurturing mathematical talent in women, and more capable of recognizing excellence in women's work. It was never about ability, it has always been about opportunity and recognition.
So, it seems pretty clear. The real question isn't about who's smarter. It's about how we can build a world that sees and supports brilliance in everyone. What do you think? Let us know down in the comments. And for more explainers like this one, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.